Hello and welcome to another Pod by the Fireside with me, Gregory Alexander Sharp. This is the second episode in our series on all things werewolf, and I'll be joined again by our resident expert in the lore of the lycanthrope, the host of viral sensation Werewolf The Podcast, multi-talented, multi-published Renaissance man, Mr. Fenrir Thorvaldsen. Fen, how are you? And how's your week been since episode 1?
Yeah, it's been okay, but I don't know about the expert thing. I've had someone from a Norse expert, not really enjoy my Norseness, so I need to work on my Norse pronunciation apparently. So I will do my best.
Indeed, and if anybody needs more information on that, episode 109 of Werewolf the Podcast, available wherever you get your podcast. Probably the same place you got this one, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I've got to say Uthenir properly. Uthenir. I can't say it properly. So
I think you're doing a pretty good job on that.
I'll do my best.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Fen, and I run a podcast that's doing all right, and it's fun. And go listen, and that'll be that's kind of me. Oh, I have to apologise here though, Greg, that I got the date wrong for Dog Soldiers. It's 2002. Sorry, after watching 563 films, the dates are a bit of a blur. So I do apologise. I really apologise to my family. I've let them down.
Well, I'm not sure an apology is needed, but if it is, I'm quite sure it's well accepted.
Yes, it will be noted.
Do you know, I'm not sure. There must surely be a place for you in the Guinness Book of Records. As maybe the only person alive who's watched every surviving werewolf movie.
That's really not the case, because I started down the Japanese manga line. Don't do it, because if you look for Japanese werewolf manga and, well, all the other stuff, we won't go into details. I was terrified by how much material has been produced. So that might be a book for the future, or it might not be. So yeah, I haven't watched everything. So if you've watched everything, you deserve the world championship, because some of it is terrible. The Werewolf in London porn parody was not the best thing in the world to watch ever, but it was done. So there we go.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
What will they think of next?
Exactly. Yeah. Watching people do things in rubber masks, basically. Anyway, moving on.
Moving on. Well, I was about to say, all right, let's do it, but I'm going to rephrase that, I think.
Yes, please.
Okay. So let's get started. As I said, this episode's dedicated to, it's the second episode of our werewolf series. It's Werewolf Mythology. I think I suggested we were going to be doing lycanthrope literature as we were closing the show out last week, and it's mythology this week, but that's okay. First 3 episodes are going to be released together, so if you want to listen to the literature one first, do that. That's fine. These don't have to be done in any particular order, but we're recording this as episode 2, so let's get to it. Picture the scene, if you will. There's been a powder cut. The lights are out. Fen and I are back in our little log cabin on the edge of that spooky forest, and we have but a single candle to pierce the veil of shadow the night has brought down upon us like a weighted blanket. The conversation turns to matters most malevolent, and eventually we begin to ponder the mythology of that most fearsome of beasts, the werewolf. Obviously. So there's a lot to unpack here. Hundreds of years worth of stuff to get through, to be honest, and we can't do all that in one podcast. We probably can't even do all that in one series of podcasts, because we're talking about a couple of millennia, basically, of history, a lot. But first up, we're going to have a look back at some of the very first mentions we could find of werewolves in human history. And actually, Fen, he might not have watched every single werewolf movie that's ever been made, but he has studied human history in its entirety, from the beginning of time until this point, as part of his research for this show. So
Thank you for pointing that out. Yes.
So hats off.
I hope you experts are listening to this.
That will please the experts at the University of Aberdeen, that's for sure. And the second topic we're going to get to will be the tales of werewolves found in European history, so European lore, you might say. And there's mountains of this. And some of it's really well documented. So we could be here for 1,000 years trying to get through all of that. So we've chosen some interesting examples and some background information that it might be news to you, and it's certainly interesting. The third topic we're going to get to will be werewolves in other cultures, and indeed there are cultures outside of Europe. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that there are only two cultures, that's European culture and others. I'm fully aware that the world's a big place and it exists beyond Europe, but there's a lot of werewolf history in Europe, I'm just saying. But it turns out there's a lot.
Where we've been brought up in, isn't it? It's kind of the classic werewolf for us.
For us it is, for sure. That kind of Central European image of a dark forest and a wolfine creature stalking the locals, that really sort of triggers the imagination. And we're going to look at how those myths have been brought into our modern times, into the modern world, and how they've sort of translated or get translated in the way we tell stories today. And we'll make some connections between the past and the present and actually have a thought about what that might mean in the future as well. So with that said, Fen, how about we lead off with a little bit of a history lesson from yourself, and maybe you can tell us a bit about the origins in the dawn of time.
The dawn of time.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm sure that werewolves have been around for a lot longer than this, but really I don't suppose it's a strictly a werewolf story, but you have the Epic of Gilgamesh in 2100 BCE. Is that 4,000 years ago, something like that?
Mm-hmm.
All these particular sort of old folklore stories, sort of Roman medieval period, are always about someone being possessed by an animalistic side, sort of working their way through that curse of this animalistic side. A lot of these characters seem to go out and have a really lot of fun and then realize it's not okay to have lots of fun, and then the curse is lifted and they become very good people. So the Epic of Gilgamesh it's basically been a rewritten story for a long time, where we get the king who meets this wild man called Enkidu, and he's the idea that he's the wild man out there, and he's going to introduce the king, who was a bit of a boy, and he takes him out and they have many adventures together and meet sorcerers and do stabby things and naughty things and stuff. And then sadly the Enkidu gets ill, and the hero of the story gets so worried that he's going to lose his wildman friend that he goes and tries to find the secret of immortality. And what he learns is that it's not a good thing to be immortal, and he doesn't want to be immortal. And the great thing to do is to enjoy life, move on, be a moral being. And then he goes back home and he starts to look after his people. He takes all his statues down to him, and all the money's funneled into his people, and he looks after his people, and the curse is kind of lifted, but we don't specifically know that he's being turned into a werewolf for the curse. We just know that he's being turned into this wild man who goes and parties and does adventures and things. Yeah, so that's kind of the first sort of evidence that we have of any kind of werewolf story.
And that's sort of almost a connection between a human life, a human existence being something good, and it can be tarnished by a transformation of sorts, whether this is a physical transformation or a sort of psychological transformation into something wild. That's bad.
Yeah, I think it's kind of pointing out that you can kind of have a good time, but it's got to be within certain limits. And if you're hurting other people, which is the story there, that he's basically taking all the money from the kingdom to put his statues up and stuff, that's not a good thing, and you've got to look after others. I think that's kind of the background of the story. Yeah. So,
okay.
that's kind of the first one. There is mention in the Bible as well, in that's the 6th century BCE. So there's the book of Daniel,
Mhm.
and I didn't know how to say this word until I watched The Matrix. Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes, yes. My dad. I'll just say, my dad was a bit of a historian, and Nebuchadnezzar was his favorite character from history
All right.
because he used to build structures called ziggurats,
Yeah.
which my dad was a big fan of. There you go.
Isn't that just a funky pyramid?
I think it is. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think
It's like
so.
a pyramid with flat bits on it.
With sort of multiple layers to it, and yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I stole my vampire ladies from that time of times. She's
right.
one of the queens that was hanging around back then. So,
That's right.
and what I love about these stories from the past is because there's no proper referenced historical matter that anyone can tell me off for. That I can kind of make up things around that. But yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, I hope I say it's right, he's then cursed, and he's turned into this beast again. He's this preening king-like person who really doesn't care about his people, and he gets cursed, and he goes into the woods, and he meets the sorceress who makes him realize that I'm not a good person. That's why I'm a wolf. And then as he travels home, he becomes a better and better person, and his wolf bits fall off basically until he gets home. Yeah, so
Okay.
it's basically the same story as again, but just slightly different in its interpretation. Yeah,
So I think I recall this is Nebuchadnezzar the second for the historians among us, 6th century BCE. I think there were at least half a dozen
there's a lot of
of
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzars,
Yeah,
and I seem to remember from somewhere that he lived as an animal for 6 years or 7 years or something like that.
yeah.
It was a number of years,
7 years in the woods. Yeah,
right?
he spent 7 years in the woods, and it's yeah. So that number seven seems to come up quite a lot, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I don't know what it is about the number seven, but be very careful about the number seven. It is the number of the beast. Oh no, that's not the number of the beast, is it? It's a different thing.
Indeed.
Yeah. So we've got the Bible, and then we've got Herodotus in the 5th century, and he talks about a tribe of werewolves who live near Scythia, and they that's like near the Ukraine now, who would turn into a pack of wolves 7 days of every month and go off and do their hunting as a pack of wolves and then come back. So that's a positive kind of thing, and he describes the way that they worked together as a pack and how wonderful it was to see these animals as they ran through the moonlight and all that kind of stuff. So he has a kind of different look on the idea of the werewolf. There doesn't seem to be any sort of focus on it being a bad curse or anything, and it seems to be pretty useful to the tribe as they go out. And it's part of what I stole when I designed my werewolf tribe, that they were in trouble, so they needed the help of a pack of wolves and all that kind of stuff.
And that was also in that part of the world, as I recall, wasn't it? Russia was it over the Russian border?
That's just where Russia was born, wasn't it? The Ukraine, really. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, that's a nice story. And then we have again just another version of the Nebuchadnezzar and the Gilgamesh story with the Petronius in the 1st century. It's a Roman novel by Petronius. The satire, I can't say it right. Satyricon. Can you say that word?
Satyricon.
Satyricon. That's it. And that has the tale of the werewolf in it. And the guy is Nicaros or Nicaros, or I'm not very good with Italian, but Nicaros I would call him. And he's a party animal, and he slowly, as he becomes more of a party animal, he becomes more debased and more animalistic, and then eventually turns into a wolf and realizes as he goes on that he doesn't want to be this wolf creature and that he wants to become back to being more human. So starts doing kind things and slowly comes back to being more of a human character. And then, of course, the Ovid, and where we get the idea of Lycans from, is the Lycan, the king of Arcadia, who was supposed to be one of these evil, horrible people who like to torture and be nasty to them. And Zeus came down to him, and he fed a baby to Zeus as his meal. So Zeus, in response, turned him into a wolf until he decided that he'd had enough and that he wanted redemption, and then became a really nice man again. So it's always this idea of you've got a curse of being an animal, and then you're being brought back to being this wonderful human being. Yeah.
There's definitely a theme that, apart from the tribe in or the gang in Ukraine, there's definitely a theme that this is, in the case of Lycan and Zeus, this is a punishment that was doled out. But for the rest of them, it's as a direct result of the actions they've taken. They've brought this down upon themselves in some way, and there's a route back to purity.
It's as though as that if you're going to behave like an animal, we'll make you into an animal. And there's no talk about full moons or any of these things in this early, and it is just a strict curse that you've been given because you've been a bad person. Obviously, apart from the tribe, but I chose that one because it just stands out as something completely different from that time frame.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of the other things as well is if you look at some of these medieval maps and all those kind of things, and the earlier maps than that, you get dog-headed men, in the lands where they don't know who lives there, or one-legged people. So I suppose this idea of like the werewolf being out there is kind of a nice thing to think about, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of a very quick version of where like the mythology of the werewolf comes from. Again, just this curse that you have to go through to prove that you're a good person. Yeah. Although Zeus is quite funny though, because he likes to spend his time as animals, doesn't he? Like a bull and a swan, or my favorite is when he manages to bed a woman by being a golden shower. It has a very different thing these days. But if you can bed a woman as a shower of rain, you're doing pretty well. Yeah.
Very good indeed. Well rescued. And Zeus, of course, transformed himself into animals typically with one objective in mind, and that was to impress women, we'll say.
Yeah.
It's clear that werewolves aren't anything new, right? We know that. There's always been something about them that's captured the imagination. Otherwise, those stories would have died out, right? They wouldn't have.
The thing that surprises me is that even in all these different parts of Europe, how it always focuses on this particular one animal, this werewolf, as being this cunning, sort of evil. I mean, we had bears and things bimbling around in the woods, and they were never seen as these horrific monster creatures. It must have been so terrifying knowing that out there in basically your back garden was this pack of creatures that could very easily come and take you down. So I can kind of understand where they're coming from, because I think we forget they had wolves in their back gardens.
Yes.
At this point, if you went into the woods, there was a likelihood, or you might hear or see, or even be on the wrong end of them. So it's very animalistic to call yourself a wolf, isn't
it? Absolutely, and quite terrifying. Quite a prospect.
Yeah, I can't imagine the feeling of that. Yeah, that must be mad.
And we're going to get into a little bit of that, I think, as we jump into the next subject, which is really around sort of the Middle Ages in pretty much Central Europe, where at that time there was a whole bunch of paranoia about the supernatural going on, and I'm talking about things like the witch trials and things like the revenants or the vampires, but also the werewolves, which had people really frightened. And we've picked out a couple of sort of data points and examples for you here that I hope you'll find interesting. So, Fen, why don't you take us into that?
Well, the medieval period really is the key period for kind of the classical idea of the werewolf. I mean, in medieval Europe, we've got the Old English and Old High German, which is werewolf, which is man-wolf. So we got the idea that men could transform themselves into wolves or wolf-like creatures. And obviously this was all to do with black magic and the curse that you have been transformed into this thing. It was always a bad thing. It was never a good thing. And then, I always think the werewolf trials were all about control of the population, because it seemed to be always people that were on the edge of society that were that sort of attributed to witchcraft and doing these certain things. And a lot of men, especially in the 15th to 17th century, if you didn't get on well with the local community, would be accused of being werewolves. And some of the trials and some of the punishments, and I think you're going to talk about some of the executions later, and absolutely awful. And they really influenced the idea of the folklore and how you would find these people out. As I was saying before, there's a great book written by a witch finder general called the Witch Hammer, where he describes how you go and find a werewolf and what you're looking for and how you control them and how you kill them and all the dangers of these things. And yeah, so again, it's this idea of the dangerous, horrible creature out there that you can become. And if you're a murderer or someone who's disliked, you seem to be a werewolf of it. And I suppose the most famous example of this is Peter Stump. The name changes, and it's in various Stump or Stummed, and that's in the Werewolf of Bedburg. And he was accused of being a werewolf. He was traveling along with he was a trader, and he was traveling along, and some woman cursed him on the side of the road. And then after that, from that point on, he was thought to be a werewolf. Obviously, we don't know what happened, but he was accused of some serious murders. And one child said that they'd seen him turn from the human into the wolf before their very eyes and things like that. But obviously, we don't actually really know the reality of the situation, which I'm sure he was just a guy that had come into the local area that nobody liked. So what they did was they decided he was going to be a werewolf. Yeah. So
with hindsight, I think they had good reason not to like him. It's reasonably well documented, I think, that he was an unpleasant human being, and in all likelihood a murderer.
Yeah.
So not a nice guy, but not necessarily a werewolf.
No, I suppose it puts another level of being horrible on top of it if he calls someone a werewolf,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Well, it's a weapon, isn't it? In those days, an accusation. To us these days, it might annoy you or get under your skin, but in those days, it could literally lead to your death.
And I suppose there's that way that if you're something other, you're an actual inhuman, then you don't have to be treated like a human, do you? So if you're a werewolf or a witch, you could understand why a wolf would attack and kill. And with Peter, there was the idea of cannibalistic and all that sort of things linked to it. We don't know how far the story went, but I suppose if he's a wolf, we can understand why he's done that. And what do you do to an animal that attacks people? You kill it. Yeah. So it's an easy way of doing something by dehumanizing someone, isn't it?
It is, and that might explain to some extent how they were able to execute him in quite the brutal manner that they did. The records suggest that his flesh was torn from his bones whilst he was conscious, with metal pincers that were red hot, and his bones then broken so that his limbs could be distributed. And then finally they chopped his head off, put it on a spike, and attached some signs to it that basically said, this chap was a werewolf, so we did this to him, to serve as a warning to anyone who might walk past. Now, I have to say, anyone who lived in the area probably knew exactly what was going on. I'm not sure they really needed to do that,
No.
but do it, apparently they did.
Yeah. It is completely inhuman how they really treated the people. I mean, if you look at the way that they dealt with the werewolves and the witches as they were, they didn't just kill them, did they? There was always some kind of next level of awfulness that was done to all these people.
Yeah, tortured to death, essentially, which is a horrid concept.
Yeah, definitely. I think that what we're talking about really takes us back to the idea of this evil creature that lives in the woods, don't we? We know, and it builds up to all those famous fairy tales, Little Red Riding Hood, and you have like Bram Stoker's and Wolf's Bride and all that different kind of things. The gothic horror fiction of the modern day, as it were.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And Stoker, I seem to remember reading somewhere that in some of his notes prior to writing Dracula exist to this day. And Dracula could have been shaped quite differently if he'd chosen some of the options that he'd been toying with.
Also, I didn't know that.
Well, one of them was that a member of it wasn't going to be Van Helsing. It was going to be like a detective story, and there would be a German detective who was tracking down the vampire whose name would be Vampire. And a member of the detective's crew, if you like, his gang, was going to get killed by a werewolf incidentally.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Never made it into the final story.
Yeah. Well, we've all been there with editors, haven't we?
Yeah, we sure have.
Remove the best character. What?
the main character, yeah.
Yeah.
Just make it about that one.
Right. Books about him.
Yeah.
I'm only joking there, by the way. No, I think it's definitely the time where we see the classic things of the moon come out and all these different ideas. But yet again, we're still not getting really into the modern ethos of what was kind of built into the modern folklore, which was quite kind of invented. We're still at this point, we're talking about someone who's been cursed, or we're talking about someone who has sort of a belt or an accoutrement that makes them turning into this werewolf, and it's still seen as a very negative animalistic thing, something against God, and you're a sinner even if you did it. I don't know what putting like if I was a werewolf and I saw a head on a stick, I don't know how I'd react to that. I don't know. Can you just like decide not to be a werewolf? Can you just go, all right, I get the idea. I don't want to be one of them anymore.
Yeah,
I'm not going to be one.
Well, maybe it's to put off aspiring werewolves who might happen to be traveling down that road. Do you know what? I'm not going to be a werewolf. I'll choose to be something different. Maybe a priest or something.
Maybe some of these werewolf Facebook groups need to get some heads on sticks then, because there's a lot of these. I go on some of these werewolf Facebook groups, and sometimes I'm like amazed by how many times there's an offer of private message me if you want to be a werewolf. I'm like, gosh,
haven't you heard what happened to Peter Stump?
Have you got any idea what's going to happen to you? I don't know. Maybe there's lots of werewolves out there that I don't know about.
Well, maybe there are. And that's a frightening thought. And just going back to the feeling of paranoia that I think there was in Central Europe at that time, and again, not just about werewolves. There was the witches and the vampires too, but we're focusing on the werewolves here. There's a story that really triggered my imagination, which was about the beast of Gévaudan in France. And we're talking about sort of 1764 through to about 1767. So like a 3-year period thereabouts. And a series of, in some cases, extremely well documented attacks on people by what was described as a monstrous wolf-like creature. And it's fair to say that hysteria sort of flooded the surrounding area, and there was a palpable sense of dread in the locals at that time, which must have been horrible to live through.
I always kind of wonder how they knew if it was a pack of wolves or if it was like an actual murderer werewolf. It kind of is a bit of a strange one, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think some of the injuries that were described looked like they were made by teeth and claws, that sort of thing. I don't think wolf attacks were entirely uncommon in Central Europe at that time either. So this stuff did happen. Wild animals, did prey. Hungry wild animals did prey on isolated individuals. It did happen. And in this instance, a number of people did survive. There were certainly people that described a wolf-like creature having attacked them. And some said it was a sort of hyena-like, others that it was like a wolf-dog thing. But most said it was a really large wolf, maybe like an unnaturally large wolf.
Okay.
And in fact, the attacks became so frequent and so brazen, they were happening in sort of broad daylight, children being taken, this sort of thing, that
Yeah.
Louis XV put up a bounty for it.
Yeah.
So money if you could kill the beast, and a lot of people rocked up, with a CV saying, I'm the best hunter in...
I'm a werewolf
I'm
hunter.
the best hunter, the best werewolf hunter in Western France. You can count
Yeah.
on me. And they would go out and they would find a wolf and they would kill it. And everyone would celebrate, like in the Monty Python film, yeah. And then somebody would get killed by a wolf the next week. And it's like, oh, good. Exactly. So there was a lot of that went on, and a lot of people trying to claim this bounty by sort of killing local wolves. And it really didn't achieve very much. I think there were a couple of spells where it went quiet for a month or two, and then it would start up again. And it was strange because it was so frequent and so repeated and so sort of brazen, broad daylight. And that wasn't happening elsewhere in France, certainly not at the time. And a lot of the people that were killed were kids, which makes sense because they're a bit smaller. But not all of them. They were adult women and men were killed as well. And
well, wolves are big creatures, aren't they? I'm always shocked when you actually stand next to a wolf. You think of a dog, and then you stand next to a wolf, and there's just something different.
Yes.
About one, it's a very different creature. So they are terrifying, aren't they, in a way?
And if you were to imagine a really, really big one that's hungry and just not afraid, I guess that would be quite a prospect if you were out in the woods on your own or tending a herd of cattle or something like that. You would be in trouble.
Yeah, no, it would be. It'd be a bit difficult. I know with there's a famous incident that happened on during World War One on the Ypres trenches, where the English, the French and the Germans actually stopped fighting so they could go and kill a wolf pack together.
Wow!
Because the wolf pack was actually preying on people from the trenches, so they'd found that they could sneak in and take people or take horses or take whatever, because there was a lot of horses in World War One.
Right.
So they go in and take, and they thought what had happened is that the wolves had gone in and started eating carrion and dead bodies, and then gone, well, we don't have to have them dead, So they've been started. So actually, the French and the Germans got together and had an amnesty for a little while they went and destroyed all the local wolves, and then went back to shooting each other afterwards. Yeah,
we're a strange species, aren't we?
Yeah, a bit different than a football game at Christmas, really.
It is.
But,
Paul McCartney didn't sing about this one, did he?
No, not really. Yeah. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. But yet again, we can see that there's this underlying tone of danger and scariness, isn't there?
There is. Yeah. And with the beast of Gévaudan, apparently there were over 200 attacks. A lot of people survived. Okay, so it's worth saying that. But about 210 people were attacked, and a lot of those were, quite badly wounded. And by the time it drew its final breath, and when we say drew its final breath, what we really mean is another wolf was killed, and it coincided with the attack stopping. So that was the beast, and it had killed 113 people.
Wow!
And that's
killed. That's not attacked. That's killed.
Attacked double that. Virtually, and killed over 100 human beings in that sort of 3-year period, which was unprecedented, and it's never happened since. So this is potentially a wolf. So why am I talking about that on this podcast? Well, it's because some people have claimed...
Did anyone actually get accused of being the werewolf then?
No, but no individual got accused of being the werewolf, but people suspected there may have been one. Because how did this creature keep disappearing so effectively?
Yeah.
And the idea was that it turned itself into its human form and just blended back in. Makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Now,
it's like guerrilla warfare, but done by wolves.
It is, yeah, indeed. Like a sneak thief, but it sneaks in and takes your life, The Beast of Gévaudan has actually inspired a lot of fiction over the years, right up to and including the Teen Wolf Netflix series.
All right.
I've not watched it, but my research tells me...
I have.
Have you? So, the descendants of the Beast of Gévaudan's first victim appear in it as werewolf hunters.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Okay.
And they share the same surname.
Right. See, these are the things I should know before I watch these things. I just watch these things blank. That's 2 things now. What was it? What was the other one? Rick Mayo was it? Yeah,
Yes.
you sent me the clip. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Rick
now
Mail in American Werewolf in London. Yeah.
I'm not going to write the 2nd edition until we've finished these podcasts.
Very wise. Very wise. Who knows what else I've got up my sleeve? I certainly don't.
Yeah. Yeah. The medieval time was the time for werewolves, and yeah, I suppose then we see humans slowly hunting them to almost entire extinction around Europe. So I think the threat of the werewolf seemed to be reduced as that went on as well. So it's kind of weird how those 2 things coincided, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it was only times of like war and of pestilence and of things like that the wolf came back into its own when it became, I suppose, where they get pushed to come out of their natural feeding patterns. Yeah. What do you think about the reintroduction of wolves? Because they're talking about reintroducing wolves into Scotland and stuff like that, which I think is a beautiful idea, but is also slightly terrifying. I know it shouldn't be.
It's a romantic idea, and I think it's wonderful to think that there are people out there who have recognized the impact of humanity on the world around us and are trying to seek ways to make that right. I'm not sure how I'd feel about that if I was a farmer in Scotland, or if I had kids that walked over the hill to school early doors or whatever.
Because we have huge problems up here with deer at times. You know, the roads are terrifying to drive down sort of twilight and evening times because you don't know what's going to pop its way out of the hedge. And what I didn't realize is that the natural predator, of course, was the wolf. So we have a lot of deer, and maybe the wolves would have sat on them as a predator species. But who knows? But I don't think it's going to fly.
Yeah. Well, they certainly still have wolves across the continental Europe, and wolf attacks do happen. They're infrequent, but they do happen, and they're not. It's not a good experience, and occasionally fatal.
Yeah, it's quite rare. I got a friend in Poland who has seen wolves in Poland. He's never had any problems with them, but he's actually seen them on the hill. Yeah, and his father was killed by a moose.
Goodness me.
Or is it an elk? I can't remember. It's the same creature, I think.
Right.
But yeah, he drove into an elk, and an elk's belly height is at the exactly same height as a windscreen. So yeah, and it's kind of scary to think that those creatures are out there, like elks and wolves and bears and all that kind of stuff, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, I mean, the worst we get is typically a badger.
An angry squirrel.
Yeah, an angry squirrel. Absolutely. We were talking about one of those earlier too. So, with that said, Europe was a frightening place to be in the medieval period. That's for sure. When it came to werewolves, but it wasn't only Europe that was a frightening place to be. There were other cultures and are other cultures around the world where these types of creatures were rumored to exist. And you did a fantastic series on Twitter where you were informing one and all about some of those different types of creatures and the places that they came from. And you've picked a few out for us tonight, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the great thing about the werewolf is it's not just limited to one place and one type of being, as it were. I mean, even in Scotland, we have a good werewolf. It's not really a werewolf; it's a dogman, and he is very helpful. I forgot his name right now, which is terrible. I got hit in the head when I was a child. But yeah, he goes fishing for the local community and would leave fish at the doorstep of someone who'd failed fishing that day and stuff like that. I think it was a nice thing that people were doing. Would drop the fish off and go, "Oh, it must have been Jamie the werewolf or whoever."
Dave the dogman.
Yeah, Dave. Dave the dogman dropped us some fish for you, mate. But yeah, so we do even see in our culture there are some nice references to it. But then when we go around the world, we see others. I mean, everyone knows what Skinwalker is. You know,
Yep.
you've all heard of Skinwalker Ranch and all that kind of thing, and that's from the Navajo culture in America. Lots of the different tribes over there have different stories about. They're not particularly just skinwalkers, but of people that are able to become beasts or have a spiritual side to become a beast. But the skinwalkers are probably the most famous from the Navajo, and they're a bit on the borderline of being good and evil. So they can be very helpful and they can be very unhelpful as well. And they're accepted within the community. The Navajo don't say that there's no skinwalkers left. And there's a really funny interview with one of the Navajo leaders, and he's asked why does he believe that there's no skinwalkers left, and he basically turns around and says, because they've got big glowy eyes, you knobhead. But he says it in a very American way. So it's like, yeah, you could tell they were a skinwalker because even in the daylight their eyes would glow. I was like, okay, so you can probably tell there's no skinwalkers left, and they would be able to see the future and see the past, and they would also be really good at tracking and finding particular things, but they were always on the outskirts of the community, and they were never allowed to have a partner. They were never allowed to have a wife and breed and things like that, and it was kind of part of the gubbins that was supposed to happen, which I thought was. I hope I've got that right, by the way. I'm only repeating what I've read.
Well, some of our Navajo audience will set us straight on that, I'm sure, if not.
Yeah. If you're studying Navajo tribal systems and things at Aberdeen University, please get in contact. And then, of course, we have my favourite, which are the berserkers, warriors of the Viking time. What I've learned is that berserkers were bearskins, and Uthastan, oh please let me say that right, Uthan or Uthastan were the wolfskins, and the wolfskins were young men who had lots of energy and would charge into battle, and then you had your berserkers, which were the older men, or tended to be thought of as being the older men, who were a little bit wiser, but would get into this kind of animal characteristic before they ran into battle. They would often go into battle not wearing very much but a furry hat and a sword and attack things. And I always thought they were a kind of made up thing. And then when I actually started reading some of the sagas and things like that, no, these guys used to sip on fly agaric juice, the magic mushrooms of the local area, lots of alcohol, and then go and fight.
Right.
Usual Saturday afternoon in Manchester.
So a bit of the old Dutch courage, as they say.
The old Dutch courage, yeah. And it used to make them very brave, and they were very excited to go to the halls of Valhalla very young. That's what their belief was, that they wanted to get there as quick as they possibly could, very bravely. So,
that's a culture and a belief system that's very alien to us these days, but it was also very alien to just about everybody else in the world back then.
Yeah, I love the Viking mentality is. I mean, what we know of it is something completely different. The idea of the Drenga, this idea that you would be willing to fight anybody for any reason, because if it's your day to die, you've got a choice to die bravely, or you might die tripping over the carpet.
Yeah.
Which way would you prefer to die?
Well, the way that's going to get you into Valhalla, obviously.
Yeah, definitely.
If you're a Viking guy.
Yeah. So their outlook on life is very different. So anything that aided them in getting to that famous state quickly, yeah, they would go for it. It was a very different outlook on life. I mean, you didn't take the mickey out of anybody's boots in Vikings times, because they would try and kill you for it. So.
Absolutely.
Again, reminds me of certain areas of Newcastle.
Quite.
Yeah. Yes. Then we have were hyenas. Those hyenas of Africa. Again, we have these creatures. It was more that the hyenas could speak, and they would be out there, and they would call members of the tribe out to meet them. And obviously, when the members of the tribe would go out to meet them, they would end up being dinner.
Yes.
So, and the little I know of hyenas is they're very, very cunning and very clever.
Mm-hmm.
So I can understand why there was a half belief that they could sit and mimic human voices on the edge of the fire and call you out to meet your doom, as it were.
And of course, they have this laughing tone.
Yeah, they're terrifying things.
They're immensely powerful. They're the only thing on the African savannah that will sort of square up to a lion.
Yeah. I mean, they're an incredible creature. Again, so much bigger than you think they're going to be. Absolutely massive. And the females are larger than the males, and they're the dominants in the tribe.
Okay.
And they actually have a pseudo penis. And what they do is they go around and they hump all the boys to put them in their place. So it's a very different way of looking at things. The hyenas are particularly terrifying, and the idea that they're clever enough to call you out and you would hear your name when you sat by the fire. I'm sure if you've got a little brother somewhere or something, there was lots of jokes that went on about that. Can you imagine?
Absolutely. Gosh, the possibilities are endless.
Yeah.
For mischief.
Well, that's terrifying. And then if we go to Japan, there's nothing specifically werewolf apart from now in manga and stuff, but we have these wonderful kitsune, and I can't say it, I'm apologizing.
I'll have a go at this one. Hengi yokai.
Yeah. And these are amazing creatures. 8-tailed wolves, 8-tailed foxes and things. Often beautiful women that then become the fox creature. And again, they're like sometimes like sirens that they'd get a man to fall in love with them and take them out into the wild, and they could be helpful, they could be mischievous, they could be all these different things, but they were a fox who had the ability to change into the human, into the woman, or into the person, as it were. So they have a very different way of looking at it.
So it's the reverse
image
almost.
It's like a reverted werewolf.
Yeah.
So, and then I suppose different ideas of the Slavic idea of the werewolf that could change at choice. So it wasn't a curse; it was just part of your makeup. Again, I can't say it. Volkodlak. I'm sorry, my Slavic languages are terrible.
I think that was pretty close, actually.
Yeah, but yeah, these were people that could use it for if they needed to go and get something done, like go get the hunting done. Or
so, like the modern idea of a shapeshifter who can just grit their teeth and suddenly it happens.
Yes, I think I based my character on the kind of idea that I think that's a modern thing in werewolf literature and TV, where you can decide, I'm going to be a werewolf now.
Yeah.
So I think that's it. So yeah, there's many examples around the world, and that's only a few of them. There are so many different, not specifically wolves, because I suppose not everywhere had wolves, but there's this idea of a predatory creature that people could turn into.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just taking a moment to consider the word myth, then, and how we tend to think of it these days in contemporary society, because there's a lot of mythology that we're talking about here, and we haven't really spoken about what a myth is. So a myth, the modern definition of a myth, is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining a natural or social phenomenon, typically involving supernatural beings. The thing that stands out in that, and shout out to Google for the definition there, other search engines are available. The thing that stands out to me in that definition is that it's a traditional story, okay? And it's something traditional, something that's passed down through the generations. That would be the definition of something that's traditional.
It's not only by word of mouth, it's things that stand in there. I mean, if you look at the Viking sagas, we have all these stories about the Vikings, but none of them were really written down until medieval times, so it's always been passed down by, and I suppose my idea of a myth is it's always got, some good intention behind it. Don't go into the woods because there are things that could eat you.
Yeah.
don't go and talk to strangers because they might not be nice. That kind of thing. I think it differentiates. A myth is a kind of a teaching tool. If we look at like the Norse sagas and things like that, they're trying to show you how to be a good person or not how to behave.
Yes.
What it is to be a good member of society. And I think the myths are the same thing. It's just a really good way of teaching your children not to do anything daft, isn't it?
I think so. And, we see it in things like the sagas and the great poems. We also see it, I think, in things like what used to be called old wives' tales.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right. And I think there's a whole rich vein of great lessons for young people in that sort of traditional generational sharing of good behavior and knowledge around. Don't do that. There's bad stuff happens.
Yeah. I mean, it's the problem with the youth is I remember every generation that's ever been has always thought that the youth of the last generation are much worse than themselves.
Yes.
I mean, I wrote a book on brain behavior and development in children, and what I found was amusing was that there's a great thing from the 2nd century BC. I can't remember the guy who wrote it, basically decrying how the kids of today can't be educated. They're all narky and horrible and all that kind of thing. But if you've got a good enough story and you convince those kids that that's going to happen, don't go in the woods because the wolves will eat you. Why? Because I've got an example of when it happened.
Yeah.
They might actually listen to it. So yeah, the myth is a great teaching tool.
Yeah, it is. And we still use tools based around stories today to teach lessons, but we tend not to share them by word of mouth anymore, right? There became a point where writing stuff down on tablets of stone became the thing to do if you wanted knowledge to endure. And then over the years that became, papyrus, and then paper, and then maybe TV and movies, right?
Yeah.
And now YouTube, and it's all in the cloud, right? It's there forever, and you can't delete stuff that's on the internet. It's there forever, as far as we know, until it isn't, I suppose. But the knowledge is certainly being shared in a very different variety of ways, and that probably, I suppose, turns the lens a little bit towards sort of contemporary culture, modern culture, and how some of those myths have manifested themselves maybe in some of the things that we connect with today, and we don't necessarily think of them as myths. The movies.
Oh yeah. What surprises me with the modern sort of view on werewolves is how many people would like to. It seems to have changed from being a curse in general to the amount of people who would actually wish that it was the case.
That's an interesting
I
point.
mean, yeah, it seems to be there's a lot of people out there who are not happy with life as they are and would want to be a vampire or would want to be a werewolf or all those kind, which is a massive change from in the past where your head was ended up on a spike. So that's one of the things that I've noticed is this kind of changing and the idea of the modern idea. So I suppose really we should look at that generation through literature and through the modern sort of films and TV, as you say, shouldn't we? Really? Yeah. So I suppose it all really started with film, really. I suppose again, I'll try and get my dates right this time. All started with film, really, for the werewolf, as it were. I mean, at the turn of the century, looking at literature, the werewolf was in the stories, but it was in the Red Riding Hood and in the Thing as a bad example, wasn't it? And then we brought, I think it's one of your favourites, isn't it? 1941, The Wolfman.
It sure is. It sure is. I was reading a list of the top 25 werewolf movies of all time, and it still comes in at I think about number 4 or number 5 on most people's lists even today. It's so influential and a great film.
Yeah, and I think it's the first popularized version werewolf movie that became popularized, and that's the first time we see the portrayal of that particular kind of character as the wolfman and this animalistic creature that they're being portrayed as now. That there's some element of the human still left inside them.
Yes.
Even though they are the werewolf, even when they're the werewolf, there's, I always think it's the idea that you have this creature sat in the back of your head, and sometimes you let go to the animalistic side of yourself, and this is the idea that we can sort of semi-control that. Sometimes it escapes and gets out and stuff, and then I suppose we have to mention her name, Anne Rice.
We do. We do.
And I love her. She's a brilliant writer. It's fantastic. I just wrote a story using her kind of prose style, which was really entertaining. I really like doing that. And she's very moralistic, and she encapsulates the difference between good and evil and what's acceptable and what's not.
And she loves to play with that dynamic too. I mean, I read all the Interview with a Vampire books, and the character Lestat de Lioncourt, he's the the baddie that everybody loves to hate and hates to love, right? But you can't help but be attracted to the character somehow.
I think that's the thing that's been brought around, isn't it? Evil now has a certain quality of attraction to it. Like something's dangerous. It's like I was always told at school, to be attractive, you've got to be the dangerous boy, or you've got to be the cool, on edge kind of dude, and all that kind of stuff. So there's something about the evil that is very attractive, that someone can get away with doing that kind of thing and behaving like that. And that seems to be a more modern thing as well, because in the past, you didn't want to be the wolf in Red Riding Hood. No, because he was bad and he got killed,
Yes.
While it seems that half the time in these stories now, you're rooting for the bad guy.
Well, and even, just going back to Anne Rice there are justifications for what they do. Lestat takes on this set of sort of moral code whereby he'll only kill criminals, murderers. So he's this sort of moral retribution on behalf of humanity.
Yeah.
Taking revenge on people they don't even know have committed these crimes, but he does, he goes out and gets them.
In his case, he's become like the anti-hero, hasn't he?
Yes.
He's willing to do the wrong thing for the right reason.
Yes, quite.
So yeah, I can see that, but that wasn't the thing of the vampire of old or the werewolf of old, was it?
No, they were a monster. They were from hell. And
if you look at Nosferatu, he wasn't thinking about whether he ought to do something before he did it.
I have to say that original depiction in the original Nosferatu movie, I can't imagine too many girls fancying him, or boys for that matter. I can't imagine anyone fancying him, really. He was quite scary looking.
No, there's somebody for everyone, though, I believe, isn't there? But maybe not with him. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
And then I think what happened then is, because the dangerous became attractive, especially with the Anne Rice kind of thing, and dangerous and androgynous as well.
Yes.
We then started stuff like the Twilight series, and the fact that, I think you said it last week very well, is that you wouldn't want your daughter to try and get off with a vampire. It doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
But they become this attractive outcast that is a romantic figure, instead of being this evil, downright dirty, horrible thing that shouldn't be put up with. Now we should accept them and understand that it's not their fault, and they're trying to do their best and all this kind of thing, and they become a romantic figure. And that's kind of how I see it changing. And then with sort of contemporary stuff, they've either gone down the line of the romantic character, or they've gone down the line of the action adventure character. So we've kind of moved away from the werewolf as the creature of horror in particular. There are still a few cracking films that come up, like Dog Soldiers, every now and again. But like these days, the werewolf, the vampire, frighteningly, zombies have become this misunderstood. We should accept them, and I suppose that's the a sign of the times in a way, the acceptance of other. So yeah, it just seems to me how the myth has changed from fear and horror.
Yeah, and I'll share with you. I was exchanging messages with another writer on Threads earlier today,
Okay.
and she was conducting a discussion about people's expectations of the things they engage with, whether that's sort of films or books or whatever it is. Don't choose something that's not your thing and then say it's no good. And
Yeah.
if you want a vampire that's a romantic lead, probably don't read Dracula. It's probably not the right one for you, right? Read Twilight, perfect for you.
Yeah.
Equally, if you want a traditional sort of the malevolent creature is the baddie type book, then make sure that you're buying the right one, because there's more choice now than there used to be. And as a consumer, I think we have to be responsible for making the right choices in what we spend our time with.
Definitely. I mean, one of the things that I like to do, because I suppose I don't know, I like to torture myself in certain aspects, is I will read lots of different various ideas on the same theories. So like with the vampire stuff and the werewolf stuff, I like to have a huge cross section of people's ideas and stuff. It's not right for everyone. I'm doing it for a reason, because I write werewolf fiction, I suppose. But I I like to do that so that I can compare different creatures from different genres. I like the idea of seeing how other people see what I see, and understand the character as they understand the character. And I've sometimes poo-pooed things and then turned around and gone, no, that's really good. I was never a real fan of Neil Gaiman, and then I read his Norse mythos, and I was like, that's absolutely fantastically written. Normally for me, it's quite Neil Gaiman is quite scattered. It's like, oh, we're doing this now, we're doing that, now we're doing this, and now we're doing that, but with that, it was absolutely fantastic. You could see that he had a real love for it, and I got his writing. And after that, I read, Dream and all these different characters. Yes, so I think it's good to vary and not look at a book and go, oh, I shouldn't read this. Although with Twilight, I did do 15 pages before I had to go and put it down and have a little cry. But yeah, we won't go any further into that.
There is, of course, the expectation versus reality. Don't one-star Anna Karenina because it hasn't got any zombies or graphic sex in it, right?
Yeah, you're dead right. One of my favorite things though is when I get a bad review. I love it when I get a bad review.
Well, some of them can be
Because,
fun in their own right.
yeah, but sometimes you just sit there and it's like you say, I just feel like giving them the money back and just saying it wasn't for you.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Like one of the best bad reviews I've ever had was basically describe my character to a T, saying that he's this person, this is how he behaves, he's horrible, he's narcissistic, he's la 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 la, and I just felt like putting it at the end of it, like, yeah,
that's exactly how he is.
yeah, that's it. You've got it. That's perfect.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like to have a look. I mean, do you do much reading around the genre yourself before you write, or have you got a key idea in your head of what you're doing?
I think there's a risk with me. There's a risk I'll start imitating.
Right.
So I tend to build stuff out in my imagination, I guess, a bit first. Don't get me wrong. The genres that I've written in thus far have been the things that I've enjoyed being a consumer of most of my life. So it's not like I'm starting from scratch. I'm not. Everything at the end of the day is inspired by something. There's very little that's truly original, even if it's a premise or whatever. But I haven't read something to give myself a run up. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah. I quite like seeing other people's takes on stuff. I really must admit. I read Lord of the Rings again recently and realized that it's a book designed for 15-year-olds, because it's brilliant. When I was 15, it was one of the best books I'd ever read in my entire life, and now I've read it recently and I'm like, it's not a lot to it, really. It's just a description of people wandering through some woods and bumping into things. There's no like deep in depth look at characters or anything like that. So also strange how your mind. I'm reading your book again for the second time, and I've just got up to the bit where Charlie's punched. I can't say his name.
Telemachus.
Yeah, and he's going to turn into. I've read it before, so I know what's going to happen. But like, there's bits of it that I've already gone. Oh right, now I see. Yeah, you got through right. Okay, because it just becomes more.
Yes.
So yeah, I like rereading and stuff as well. But I think if you're buying a book and you're looking for a certain thing, then make sure you've looked into it.
This is it. If you've got an idea of what you want, and make sure you get it, because if you get something else, it might be something that you actually don't want. It might also be something that you didn't know you wanted. There is the happy accident, but don't hold it against a writer if you've bought the wrong book, I guess.
Well, I told you recently, I've done the thing of reading the classics like Moby Dick and things that I would never look at recently, and realised that there's a reason why they're the classics, because they're really good. I've just finished Crime and Punishment, and that was a brilliant book. And there's a reason why it's a classic, So yeah, you got to choose them well.
Indeed. Well, look, we've
gone well over. Sorry.
We said there was a bit to unpack there, didn't we? And and guess what? There certainly was. And do you know what? Have you seen the candle burns low? Its wick now nothing more than a fading ember, but it's all right, because we've been up all night and daybreak is upon us once more. We've survived another night in a log cabin. It's all good. So thank you so much for another fantastic conversation on the subject of werewolves. And a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to remember to do the housekeeping this time.
All right, sorry.
So if you want to hear more from Fenrir Thorvaldsen, you can find him on all your usual social media channels, Twitter, Facebook being among the very top ones there. He's very active across both of those. Yeah. But you're on all the others too, really, aren't you? Or your TikToks and YouTubes and whatnot.
There's only two of us in the world, so you'll find me if you put that name in Google.
There is another, is there?
Yeah, there is another Fenrir Thorvaldsen. Yeah. I was really sorry to hear that.
Gosh. Well, you're the first one I've met.
Well, if you, I've got the other one on Instagram.
Oh, maybe I'll track him down. Introduce myself, so I can say I know too. Maybe
common name.
But in particular, folks, do check out Werewolf the Podcast if you haven't already. It is a lot of fun, and it's quite horrifying. It's thought-provoking, and it's great. It's imaginative, and it really genuinely is truly original. Yeah. And it's you're knocking it out the park. It's a viral sensation on podcasting, and that's true.
And I would say check out Greg's book, because it is a brilliant book. And I as I've said before, I don't say that very often about literature. I'm quite a snob when it comes to it. And when I read his book, I was a bit gutted how good it was, to be honest. Competition and all that.
You really are. I said this last time, but you're being very kind. But I'll take it. I'll take it where I can get it.
No, honestly, you can see from the reviews and Goodreads and everything that you're getting what you deserve. Honestly.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So, talking of literature, that's the subject next time. Lycanthrope literature, I think we're calling that. So we'll be back next time. That will be episode number 3. This was episode number 2. We're releasing 1, 2, and 3 all at the same time. So you could really binge the heck out of an evening on werewolves by picking these first 3 up. There will be episodes 4 and 5 to follow as well. Until next time, Fen, it's good night, isn't it?
It's good night from him, is it?
Oh, it's good night from me. And
it's good night from him.
Good night.
Good night. Yeah.